Jay's actually still under that ladder back there right now. One of the first things we'll do when we decorate is free him. It is great to be with you guys this morning. Just want to make a special mention and wish Josh a happy birthday. Josh has been a huge gift to our church. We're thankful for him. Josh just turned 30, so now you get to stretch before you do anything physical. Welcome to that phase of your life. Hey, we've been in a season of intentionally studying the book of John, and what we've been doing on Sundays is diving really deeply into specific passages. Our hope has been that as we have been jumping in and out of these passages, that you have been following along in our study guide during the week that we provided. And the reason that we've done this, the reason we've camped out in the Gospel of John for 7 weeks now, is because we want to see who Jesus is and what it means to follow him. As a church, our vision for the year is that we would be a people who make disciples as we go. Being a disciple is someone who follows Jesus, who lives the way that Jesus does. And for us to do that effectively, we need to know who we're following and what that's supposed to look like. Enter the Gospel of John. It was written with the explicit purpose of showing people that Jesus is the Son of God. So how do we follow someone that we don't know? John is the way that we know who we follow. And so as we jump into John, we're going to be in chapter 21 today. I think this will be potentially a transformational passage because it's going to confront one of our biggest challenges in how we follow Jesus. Here's a question that we've got to answer. How do we follow Jesus in the wake of failure? I think there's two different ways that we look at failure. There's the way that we see failure unfold through the eyes of God, then there's the way we see failure unfold through the eyes of the world. And we have been conditioned to react to failure through the lens of the culture around us. When I was in high school, I grew up in Texas, and you legally just have to play football there. It's part of the deal. And so high school football, believe it or not always synonymous with the kingdom of God. And so we were late 90s, I think our coaches would go to prison for most of what they did to us at the time. Now, we were having a practice, and there was a kid on the team who was one of our running backs. He was lower on the depth chart, so that means he was not necessarily the sharpest tailback in the drawer. And so we were doing this drill where, based on where the model defense was lined up, there would be an audible call, and an odd number meant that it was going left, and an even number meant that it was going right. And this was supposed to teach us how to respond to what the defense was doing. And so this guy, I still remember his name, I won't say it just for his sake because of how the story ends, goes up and had no idea what was going on. And so it was an even number call, and he went left. That's not what you're supposed to do. So, and instantly the drill stops, and the coach comes out and just starts screaming at him about why the even numbers are supposed to be right and the odds are supposed to be left, and he's just lighting this guy up in front of everyone, silently watching, and he ends by saying, this was the mistake you made, and that's not going to happen again, and you want to know why? And the guy looks at the coach, and he's waiting for coaching and instruction. And yeah, I want to know why. How can I fix this problem? The coach goes, because you're never going in a drill again. Now get over on the sideline and stay there. And listen, hand up. This guy never saw the field again in practice. Like literally messed up a drill. The coach wasn't lying. He literally never practiced again. That was the PG version of what the coach told him. The actual version, I can't say here. And so the gist was, you will never see the field again in practice because you messed up. And I think that's honestly, it's funny, a little bit traumatic, but also a picture of how the world paints a picture of what happens in the midst of failure. If you fail, you are disqualified. We're a culture that hates failure. We don't deal with it well. So much of our internal drive is built around avoiding failure because we have this connection between performance and acceptance, right? And so what's interesting is when we inevitably are less than perfect, we're confronted with this difficulty in following Jesus. How do I follow Jesus in the midst of failure? What is his posture towards me? How does he respond to my failure? What does he want from me? Am I still in? Am I out? What do I do now? How do I get back in? And we have all of these different ways that we respond to failure that are going to be met by Jesus, not in a rebuke, not in a command, not in a test, but in an invitation. So today in chapter 21, we're going to see a glimpse into the invitation that Jesus gives us. And if you went on the women's retreat, this was really going to be connected with this idea that you looked at of these distortions we have of who God is. And the women went over all of these specific distortions we have about the identity of Jesus. And I'm sure the women's ministry team would love to share the information that they gave out with you anytime that you would ask them. But I think one of the reasons it was such a powerful weekend for our women is because this taps into one of the biggest barriers that we have in trying to be a disciple or make disciples. And that's, what do we do in the midst of failure? Because in the midst of our failure is where we begin to distort the image of God. That's why this invitation is such an important aspect of our understanding of who Jesus is. And so, just to give you a little bit of background, because we've been jumping in and out of the narrative, this is after the death and resurrection of Jesus. And if you remember, after the arrest of Jesus, Peter was one of the disciples. He was outspoken. He was very strong-willed. He was probably an Enneagram 8. And Jesus said, listen, one of you guys is going to deny me 3 times before the morning. And Peter says, I'll never do that. Sure enough, guess what happens? After Jesus was arrested, the disciples were scared. Peter denied Jesus 3 times. I don't know the guy, never seen him, never been around him, not me, I don't know who you're talking about. So imagine the wake of failure that you feel after rejecting the teacher that you've been following for right about 3 years. So skip ahead to chapter 21. Jesus has ascended the grave. He is on earth before he goes to heaven, and he has been fishing with the disciples. He finds them back doing what they were doing before he called them. And they get this miraculous catch, and they're cooking breakfast on the shore, and they now understand that this is Jesus raised from the dead. So imagine being confronted by the person that you rejected. Imagine what he's feeling, his expectations, how awkward it is around this fire. When he knows that Jesus knows, very recently, he rejected everything about him. You can imagine he's waiting for Jesus maybe to sound more like my high school football coach. And I wonder if that's kind of what we wait for Jesus to sound like in the wake of our failure and in the wake of our shortcoming. It's interesting what Jesus does. So in verse 15, when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? So there's some debate over who these are. Some people think that Jesus is asking him, do you love me more than the other disciples do? That doesn't really fit into what we're going to see unfold here in the narrative. That's probably not the best interpretation of that. Other people think he's asking him, do you love me more than the fish, which would be representative of his old job, his old way of life. Other people think maybe he was asking him, do you love me more than these? Meaning, do you love me more than you love your friends? Either one of the latter 2 interpretations is probably preferable, but it gets to the heart of what Jesus is asking him. He's saying, do you love me more than anything else around you? Ultimately, am I your first love? And what's fascinating about this is the first words he speaks to him are not, hey, let me tell you about what you did wrong. It's not, hey, here's what you need to do to get back in my good graces. He doesn't say, hey, here's how you can make up for the mistake that you made. He gives him this question. He gives him actually an invitation. He says, do you love me? I think what's shocking about this is in the aftermath of a failure like Peter's, his assumption was probably that Jesus would not be interested in or want his love, right? That he had disqualified himself from being able to love Jesus because of his betrayal. And he can look at his performance and assume that somehow, because he was less than perfect, Jesus would meet him with rebuke and judgment, and he'd been disqualified from being in the inner circle. What Jesus does is he gives him an invitation to love him. And the way that he frames it is so telling about the gift of this invitation. He says, do you love me more than everything else around you? Am I more to you than the fish? Am I more to you than your friends? Am I more to you than? And then you can honestly fill in the blank any way you want, because ultimately what he's calling him back into is a relationship where he worships him for who he is. Do you understand who I am? Do you understand that I am the Son of God? Do you understand and love me like I am your Savior? He invites him into a proper understanding and love for Jesus. And so I wonder how many of us, in the midst of failure, don't assume that Jesus is going to respond to our failure with an invitation to love, but we assume that he's going to respond with rejection. So when we think about who Jesus is, the first thing that erodes in the wake of our failure is not our behavior, but our love. In the wake of our failure, we say, I'm not worthy of loving Jesus, so we turn to lesser loves because we think that's all we have. Well, I have to chase these idols because I'm disqualified from loving Jesus. I've lost the privilege of doing that, so I guess I have to settle for the idol of success. Or I guess I have to settle for this idol of addiction or anger or money or, again, like whatever these are. We disqualify ourselves from being able to love Jesus, and so we don't change our behavior, we change our loves. And the invitation of Christ in the wake of failure is to come back to loving him for who he is. And that's not a selfish or arrogant invitation by Jesus. Because the best thing for Peter's soul, the best thing for anyone's soul, is to love Jesus more than anything else. That's what our heart was created to do. And I just wonder, in the wake of failures, have we turned to lesser loves because we think that we've been disqualified from what is our first love through the gospel of Jesus Christ? Can you think of spaces in your life where you need to hear this invitation of Jesus to return to loving him again? Not after you make up for what you did wrong. Again, he doesn't say, here's what you need to do first. He doesn't say, because you messed up, I need you to go do some community service, right? I need you to get your life back together. I need you to give some money to the church before you. He doesn't say any of that. He doesn't say, hey, maybe if you can just kind of do some external behavioral modification, then you can come and love me again. That's not his invitation. He starts with what Peter loves. Is, do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than these? That's the question. The first invitation he gives us is to love him. Everything about being a disciple of Jesus Christ starts with what we love. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, how are we responding to Jesus' invitation to love him? Do we even have an awareness that that is his primary invitation? Or have we replaced the invitation of Jesus with the false invitations of the world, or even sometimes self-righteous religion? Have we replaced an invitation to love with an invitation to perform, or an invitation to hide, or an invitation to overcome? How much of our energy in following Jesus is pointed at loving, and how much of our energy is pointed towards performing? You know, sometimes maybe we don't misunderstand his invitation through rejection. Maybe our misunderstanding is pointed more towards our need to perform. And so you're like, I don't really get on board with the rejection thing. I don't feel rejected. I just feel like now I got to really make up for it. And so discipleship doesn't feel life-giving to you. It doesn't feel attractive. It doesn't feel life-giving at all. It feels exhausting because in our minds, we have twisted this invitation to love into this invitation to perform. And we think that what he would say to Peter and to us would be something more like, Peter, are you going to do it right next time? Peter, are you going to do better? Peter, how are you going to change your response to a world that's asking if you love me? And so we have worn ourselves out because we've started discipleship with performance. We're going to see that Jesus does call us into actions. It's just that's not where he starts. And so, we've said this so many times. I can imagine if I'm tired of saying it, you're tired of hearing it. However, in light of Scripture, it's worth noting that so many of us, when we have conversations about how we're doing spiritually, so many of us, almost all of us, me included, like, man, I'm just exhausted. I feel like I'm always going to the next thing. I never get my to-do list done. There's always something going wrong. There's always someone unhappy. There's always something that I'm not getting done, and I am tired. There's too many things happening. I don't have time. I am exhausted. And in the midst of that exhaustion, when we think about following Jesus, we're like, no, I don't have time for that. I'm exhausted. Because in our minds, when we think about the invitation that Jesus would give us to follow him, all we can do is say, man, part of the reason why I'm exhausted, there's times that I've loved other stuff more than Jesus. I've spent more time loving this than him. So I've got to do double the work because I can't start following him until I make up for all the stuff I did wrong. And we're tired. Or like, I'm gonna just catch the discipleship later. I'm exhausted. I don't want to hear the invitation to do stuff and perform, so I'm just gonna pretend like it's not there. And in doing that, or maybe you are more self-disciplined than me, and you're like, okay, fine, I'll do it. Give me the double work. And we burn ourselves out and wear ourselves out and feel spiritually dry and empty and wonder why. And it's because we've twisted an invitation to love into an invitation to perform. How different would our spiritual lives be if we started our understanding of discipleship by accepting Jesus' invitation to love him more than anything else? I wonder how different our perspective on who God is and how he sees us would be if we could rest and celebrate in the reality that his primary invitation to us is to love him more than everything else, and to experience the safety and the freedom and the joy that comes from simply loving Christ more than everything else in your life. That's not a one-size-fits-all silver bullet, like, okay, I love Jesus and my life is perfect. That's not what he says, as we'll see in the passage. That's not the promise he's making. That's not the invitation he's giving. He's actually giving a greater invitation. He's saying in the midst of suffering and hardship, in the midst of the brokenness of the world, in the midst of your struggles, the worship of Jesus Christ is a safe harbor. It's a safe harbor. He's going to go on and ask him, and he's going to kind of complete this thought. Because Peter says, of course he does, he says, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Then Jesus said to him, feed my lambs. You can say sheep too, either one's fine. He said to him a second time, Jesus said a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, tend my sheep. Then Jesus said to him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. So let's do some work in here for a minute, because this is a well-studied, well-talked about passage of Scripture around some of the words that Jesus is using here. And so he does alternate the word that he's using for love. There's like 3 Greek words for love, and they're all kind of different aspects of love. There's a friendship love. There is what I'll call a sensual love, if you can follow me. And then there is like a deep, wholehearted love. And he kind of circles through 2 of those 3 in this passage. And there's a school of thought that says he's asking him, do you love me a lot? And Peter says, well, I love you a little. And he says, well, do you love me a lot? And he says, well, I love you a little. And Jesus ends with, fine, do you love me medium? And he says, okay, let's agree on that. That's not really going to work well with the theological framework of where Jesus ends, because it sounds like Jesus is settling for less than what he originally asked for. Like Jesus is somehow, he's negotiating with him a little bit. Like, if you just love me a little, we're good. Nowhere in Scripture does God command him to, just love me medium. That's never grammatically what God has called his people to. So that can't be what's happening here in the alternating of the words. In the Gospel of John, what we see is that John, as he was writing in the Greek, was more likely to alternate these words just to mean love in a general sense than other authors in the New Testament. So it is a safe interpretation to look at this and say the point Jesus is making is not that he's asking him about the degrees of love that he's giving him. It seems that he's just asking them in general, do you love me with your whole heart, right? In fact, when it says that he was grieved when he asked him a third time, it wasn't because Jesus is frustrated, like, nope, you still don't get it. That's probably not why he was grieved. The reality of him being grieved when he hears Jesus ask him a third time is it's impossible to escape the mirrored parallel of the third time that Peter denied Jesus. Grammatically, it's much more likely that Peter understood exactly what Jesus was doing when he asked him a third time. The reason that Jesus paralleled this, though, wasn't out of judgment or rejection. It was out of restoration. He's saying, this is going to look exactly like your rejection of me, but it's going to be backwards. Because what he does with Peter is he has Peter affirm his love for him 3 times. And the number 3 has a lot of different kind of ideas or kind of semantic force behind it. But there was an idea of like fullness or completeness in that number, kind of like it's for real, okay, if we can just do that in English a little bit. And so the meaning of this third time that's grieving Peter is because he's feeling the weight of what happened, And he's recognizing that Jesus is intentionally moving him out of the shame of his rejection into something else, right? And so it's interesting before we get into that, because that's where we close, but he also does something in here that's really important that we can't miss. Every time he asks him, do you love me? And he says, yes, his response is very specific. What does he say? He doesn't say, that's great, so go pray some more. He doesn't say, good, you're in now, we're cool. He says, feed my sheep. Is Jesus asking him to take care of his animals before he goes on a trip? The answer is no. When he says, feed my sheep, what he is asking and instructing him to do is care for his people. And when you look backwards into the call that Jesus has been putting on the lives of the disciples through the entirety of his earthly ministry, there has always been this expectation that because of their position in the ministry of Jesus, one of their primary roles was to love and shepherd and care for God's people. There's a constant theme of that in the New Testament. So the invitation that he's extending is to love his people well. If you love me, then you'll love my people. So when we think about how God responds in the wake of our failure, what does that invitation look like? It's interesting that it's to do two things. And it's the same two things that God has always called his people to do back into the Shema in Deuteronomy. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus already did the who's my neighbor thing, right? Like he said, everybody's your neighbor. You love everybody. So he's telling Peter here, feed my sheep. If you love me, then you'll care for my people. So question for us. Does our failure exempt us from taking part in the purpose that God has put on our lives as Christians? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. In the same way that our failure can make us feel like, oh man, I can't love Jesus. In the same way, our failure, I think, can make us feel like, I can't love people. I mean, I can love them, but like I can't do anything. I can't actually care for people. That's for like the good Christians to do, you know? Like there's different categories, right? And so I'm afraid that for a lot of us, what is stopping us from making disciples of Jesus or being disciples of Jesus isn't that we don't want to love people, it's just that we don't feel qualified. Well, I can't do that because here's a list of the ways that I've messed up. And listen, hear me, there are standards that God and the church has for leadership. If you work with kids, we're going to need you to pass a background check. That's not what this is talking about. This is talking about the rhythm of life and state of your heart. If you love God, then there is a natural invitation to love people. And listen, this is an aspect of our faith that I think is so important because it's so defining of our community. This is not something where it's like, hey, we need to really do this better. Anyone that has been around Roswell, anyone who's been here for the first time, anyone who is new or visiting, all comes away saying the same thing. I have never been in a place where people are so welcoming and loving. So listen, this is not a, hey, we need to start doing this. This is a, hey, the way that we do this is an affirmation of our love for God, and we've got to continue to make this a core part of what we teach people when we say this is what it means to follow Jesus. Just in this past year, I've heard so many stories of the way that we're providing and caring for people. I've heard stories of Bible studies helping people furnish an apartment. I have heard stories of people helping intervene in situations at schools. I've heard stories of people praying over the sick, meeting physical needs with their generosity, with checks, showing up in the midst of suffering. This is something as a church that I think reflects the heart that we have for the Lord. There's this natural invitation when we love God that we will also love his people, because you can't love God and not love people. That is an impossibility in the science of spiritual physics, which I just made up. It's not a real science. You can't love God and hate people. It doesn't work that way. And so listen, I just wonder, have we disqualified ourselves from loving people? Because we're like, wow, man, I can't. I messed up once. I'm not perfect. I did this wrong, or I did that wrong. I don't know that much. I can't do that. Well, Jesus goes to the guy that just said, yeah, I don't know him, and said, hey, do you love me? Then fulfill your purpose. Hey, do you love me? Fulfill your calling. Do you love me? Be restored into what I promised you would do. In so many passages, when you look at your subheading in your text, they'll call this the restoration of Peter. And I think it's not just the relational restoration that Jesus gives Peter. By the way, gives Peter because Jesus never moved relationally with Peter, right? Like, he never stopped loving him. This is for Peter's end of the deal, for Peter to understand, you were never out. I still love you. So he restores Peter's understanding of the relationship. Then he restores Peter's understanding of his calling. He said, you're not disqualified. Like, you're still in. I'm still asking you to be a part of the movement of God and be a part of what I'm doing here on earth. You haven't lost your place in the church. So let's go on, because this next part is really difficult, but I think it's really meaningful. So after he asks him the third time and says, feed my sheep, Jesus in verse 18 says, truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. Most people would tell you that grammatically what's undisputable about this is Jesus is actually quoting a Middle Eastern proverb about getting old, right? And it's basically, when you're young, you do what you want, but when you're old, people just take you and make you do what you're supposed to do, and you don't have a lot of say in it. What he's actually saying, there's a parenthetical notation on this. This he said to show by what kind of death he was going to glorify God. And after saying this, he said to him, follow me. Now, at first reading, this really doesn't feel like he's restored Peter, because it sounds like what he's saying is, do you love me? Yeah. Okay, good. Take care of my people, then you're going to die bad. That phrase, stretching out your hands, would have been a colloquialism for what happens when you're crucified, right? And here's what we know historically about how Peter died. He was crucified upside down. And he asked to be crucified upside down because he said, I'm not worthy to die in the same manner of Jesus. And so, like, at first reading, you're like, wait a second, this doesn't sound like a good deal. This doesn't sound like an invitation I want. So I think for us to grasp the weight and meaning of this, it's important that we step into the spiritual reality that Jesus has been speaking into his disciples for the last 3 years, and their understanding of what it looks like to be blessed and loved by God. So I think we live in this world, and it kind of goes back to how we feel about failure, where there's this paradigm that anytime there's something that's negative or suffering, then it must be a punishment and we've done something wrong, right? Like, I think we've built in this understanding of the world that if we do things right, the natural consequence for right is temporary blessing. I say temporary because one day money, power, success, fame, all that stuff goes away, right? So we live in this paradigm. We're like, well, this can't be a good thing, because if you die, well, then that's clearly not a blessing. We've talked about this last week with this idea of the kingdom of God, right? It's always seen as this eternal thing. And Scripture actually talks about the level of glory that God gets when people suffer in his name, but also the reward for those that do so. And so really every one of the disciples was murdered for their faith. Just almost all of them. It went really bad. And we don't know for sure. Most of it's kind of apocryphal, traditional teaching. But every single one of these guys died for their faith. They seem to understand that because Jesus has told them multiple times, to follow me means to take up your cross and die to yourself. So there's this expectation that the disciples had that what it means to follow Jesus is to die to everything they had and fully devote their lives to him. And whatever happened, happened, but it was worth it because they knew who Jesus was and they knew what they were doing. Right? So, what is he really saying to Peter here when he says, hey, this is what's going to happen to you? I think it's intentional that he ends this with follow me, because if you remember that, those are the same words that he gave when he first called the disciples. This is an intentional bookend with the same phrase to communicate a message about what Jesus is saying here. In the aftermath of Peter's failure, I think that his expectation, his struggle, his challenge is the same that ours would be in that situation. I failed. Am I disqualified? Have I been kicked out? Am I done? Jesus' response here is, you are still exactly in the place before you messed up. Nothing has changed. You are still called to be my disciple. You still have a purpose to lead the church. You're still going to die for your faith. If you remember, what he's told Peter is that Peter would be the one on whom he built his church. He had this key role in the expansion of the gospel out into the world. I think it's fair to say that we are here now largely because of Peter's obedience and what he did in sharing the gospel. What Jesus is saying here is you are never out. You're still in. Your failure does not dictate your position with me, relationally, practically, spiritually, I still love you. This is a weird way to say I love you because he's prophesying his death, right? That sits weird with us. But again, for 3 years now, he'd been telling them, hey, if you really follow me, it's going to cost you. And they said, yes, Lord, we want to do that. In fact, we want to argue about who gets to sit at your right hand. And Jesus says, be careful, you don't know what you're asking. Because the message of Jesus was that spiritual kingdom was not related to earthly kingdom. And so what he's telling Peter here is you will fulfill the ministry that I promised you. Here's another way of saying this. Jesus is giving Peter an invitation to be loved by him. How is Jesus loving him in this? Let's talk about that. Jesus is loving him by doing 3 things. He's affirming his position, he's affirming his calling, and he's affirming his relationship with God. In the explicit aftermath of his failure, he is affirming that Peter is still a part of God's kingdom. Saying, you're still in, man. He's affirming his calling and purpose. Your failure did not disqualify you from fulfilling the purpose. He's fulfilling his relationship. He said, I'm still with you. Your connection to me is just like it was before you denied me 3 times. He's giving him this invitation to allow him to be loved by God. And I wonder, when you look at the way that our relationship with God works in Scripture, it always starts with God initiating it. Our relationship with God is always initiated by the grace and love of God stepping into us in our brokenness. At every point throughout the Old and New Testament, God initiates a relationship with us. In the midst of Peter's failure, Jesus reinitiates relationship with him. And I wonder, when we think about following Jesus, when we think about following Jesus in the wake of our failure, I wonder if when we think about his invitation to love him and we think about his invitation to love people, the missing link in us really walking into that is understanding the third invitation. Is that before anything else, God's inviting us to be loved by him. Ephesians talks about this, right? He says, even when you were dead in your sin, God loved you and sent Jesus Christ to die for you. And I wonder if what stops us from really following Jesus is the inability we have to believe that God wants to love us. I think the most powerful invitation that Jesus gives here is this invitation for Peter to come and experience the love of God, to come and experience the promises of God, and to come experience the reality that God had called him into the very first time he showed up on the beach at the beginning of the Gospels. And I just wonder how many of us need to start here. When we think about making disciples, before we get into this, what do I do? Before we get into this is how I'm bad. Before we do anything, we need to contemplate and experience the invitation that God has given us to be loved by him. Because what we believe is that we are who we are because we've been loved by Jesus. We don't believe that we're saved by our good works. We don't believe we're saved by our righteousness because we don't believe we have it. We don't believe that we're saved by how impressive we can be or by all of the things that we can do or by what's in our bank account or by who we know or what we can kind of accomplish in the corridors of earthly power. We believe that regardless of who you are and where you come from, that as a Christian, what makes us is that we were loved by God and called to be his children as a gift through grace. Jesus Christ died on the cross for our sins. I think it's easy to forget that because we get busy, we get tired, we get guilty, and we distort who God is, and we think he sounds more like a football coach that's yelling at us, hitting our helmet with a whistle. And we don't think about the invitation that Jesus gives explicitly over and over again in the Gospels. I think this is one of the most powerful sections, though, because he meets Peter in a place that we've been, on the back of failure. And so instead of on the back of failure, us stepping away from God and disqualifying ourselves because we're scared, this is an invitation for us to step towards God and first experience the love that he has called us to receive. To receive. Some of us aren't good at experiencing reception of love. We feel guilty. We feel like, oh man, I haven't earned that. Well, no, you're right. You haven't. That's why it's called celebrating communion. We celebrate it because it's a gift. We need to respond to that invitation of receiving love by reflecting that love back to our Heavenly Father and feeling the freedom to love Him, unencumbered by our imperfections. And then finally, listen, as an overflow to that, He makes this really simple. He says, take care of the people around you. Love the people that I've put around you. We're not defined by our guilt. We're not defined by our failure. We're defined by this invitation of the gospel of Jesus Christ. An invitation of grace, an invitation to experience the love and forgiveness of God, and the invitation to live as His children, where we reflect that love out to one another. So what we'll do in response to this spiritual truth is celebrate these tangible reminders of a reality that's hard to hold on to in the midst of a busy world, in the midst of a world where we fail and are failed by others, in the midst of the world where we're just tired and guilty and angry and frustrated. We have these tangible anchors that we hold and touch and taste to allow us this glimpse of holding and touching and tasting the grace and mercy of God. This tangible way that we experience and receive the love that our Savior had for us. And so this morning, if you put your faith in Jesus Christ, if you're a believer, if you have experienced the love of God, we would invite you to join those who have made this same proclamation and celebration for 2,000 years and root our hearts in the love and mercy of God as experienced and expressed through the death and resurrection of Jesus. Would you pray with me? God, we thank you for the reality of your invitation. That in the aftermath of our failure, you don't show up in a posture of judgment. You don't show up in a posture of demands. You don't show up in a posture of rejection. You show up in a posture of gracious invitation. An invitation that is rooted in your love for us and that results in an overflowing love that we show for your people. God, we pray that you would empower us to live not out of guilt or anger or fear, but out of security and joy in our identity in you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.